The first thing you need to understand is that I was already underground when the world ended. Not metaphorically, not in the way people say that now, looking back, reconstructing meaning from wreckage. I was literally 31 feet below the surface of Harlan Lake, Minnesota, sitting in a sealed pressure chamber I had spent 4 years building with my own hands, eating a can of cold chickpeas and reading a dog-eared manual on subsurface ventilation dynamics. The date was November 14th. I remember because my sister Dara had texted me that morning, one of her rare check-ins, asking if I was coming home for Thanksgiving. I told her I had work to finish. That was the last message either of us sent. My name is Callum Voss. I was 37 years old, a civil engineer by training, and a catastrophist by temperament. The two things are not as different as people assume. Engineering teaches you to account for failure, to ask not whether something will break, but when, and what happens to everything attached to it when it does. My whole adult life had been spent in that discipline. Load-bearing calculations, stress tolerances, points of structural collapse. Somewhere along the way, I had started applying that logic to larger systems, economies, institutions, disease vectors. I was not a prepper in the theatrical sense. I didn't wear camouflage or stockpile ammunition for the pleasure of it. I built the shelter because the math, as I understood it, eventually demanded one. The shelter itself was a converted pressure hull, decommissioned from a scientific research program in 2019, purchased through a government surplus auction for less than a used car. Cylindrical, 14 feet in diameter, 40 feet long. I had sunk it into the lake bed over 3 summers using a rented crane and a methodology I'd developed from offshore platform installation literature. The lake was shallow enough at its northern end. 8 feet of water, which froze solid to a depth of 4.5 feet by mid-December. That the installation had been feasible for one determined, sleep-deprived person working in short windows between ice seasons. The hull sat in packed silt, anchored with 4 driven rods, topped with a vertical access shaft that terminated in a surface hatch I had disguised as a fishing shanty. Above me, in those first hours, there was ice. I had a radio, a shortwave unit, battery-backed with a hand-crank charging mechanism, and I had been picking up fragmented transmissions for 3 days before the one that finally made everything coherent. The fragments had been alarming, but unspecific. Words like containment and perimeter appeared repeatedly, attached to city names I recognized. A news anchor in Chicago spoke in a tone that I'd never heard on broadcast media before. Not performed urgency, but real fatigue, the kind that comes after the body has been running on adrenaline for too long and the voice simply stops cooperating. Then the Chicago signal dropped. I cycled through frequencies. Minneapolis was still broadcasting at 11:40 p.m. on November 13th. By 4 a.m. on the 14th, it wasn't. That morning, when Dara texted, I was already in the shelter. I had gone down 3 days earlier under the pretense of a final equipment check. The pretense had been mostly for my own benefit. I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that the threshold had been crossed, that I had moved from preparation into activation. When I sent her that message about Thanksgiving, I was sitting exactly where I'd be sitting for the next 91 days. I did not tell her where I was. I had never told anyone where the shelter was. That decision, which I'd always framed to myself as operational security, became the thing I would spend the most time examining in the long quiet that followed. Outside, across the surface of the frozen lake, there was nothing yet, just snow and tree line, and the particular silence of a Minnesota morning in early winter. That silence lasted approximately 4 more hours. The sound that ended it was not what I expected. I had spent considerable time in the years before trying to prepare myself psychologically for what a genuine collapse event would sound like from inside an insulated steel hull beneath a frozen lake. I imagined sirens, mass vehicle movement, the distant percussion of civil infrastructure failing. What I actually heard, at 2:17 p.m. on November 14th, was a single snowmobile. It was moving fast. I could tell from the engine pitch, the way it climbed in frequency and then cut abruptly, about 40 meters northeast of my position. The shelter's hull was not soundproof. It was pressure sealed and thermally insulated, but sound traveled through water and ice and silt in ways that surprised me the first time I'd noticed it during construction. I had installed a passive acoustic sensor on the exterior, essentially a contact microphone mounted on the hull's top side, feeding a small amplifier inside. I could hear footsteps on the ice directly above me as a low rhythmic vibration, heavier impacts. A fallen tree, a vehicle, registered as sharp, brief shocks. The snowmobile cutting out was a shock. Then voices, 2 of them, male, close together. The language was English, but I couldn't parse full sentences, only fragments amplified and distorted by passage through 4.5 feet of ice and 8 feet of water. The words that came through clearly enough to reconstruct, moving this way and can't outrun it. And one other phrase that landed in my chest like a dropped wrench. They're already at the tree line. I did not move. I sat in the main living section of the hull, a 12-foot segment behind the equipment bay, and I listened to those 2 voices argue for 6 minutes. The argument was physical as much as verbal. I could hear footfalls, the creak of weight redistributing on ice. Something dragged. Then a third sound entered the acoustic picture, and this one required no interpretation. It was not a human voice. It occupied a register adjacent to human vocalization. The same frequency range, the same approximate cadence of expulsion. But the quality was wrong in a way that I could not have described precisely then, and still struggle to now. It was like hearing a recording of a voice played back at the wrong speed, the emotional content stripped out and replaced with something that wasn't emotion at all. Not anger, not hunger, something more mechanical, more continuous. It was coming from the tree line to the north. The 2 men on the ice had gone quiet. Then one of them started running. I could track his weight distribution, the irregular pound of someone running badly, favoring one side. The other one stayed still for a long moment, long enough that I remember counting breaths. Then he ran too, in a different direction. The third sound kept coming. Slow, inexhaustible. The sound of something that had no concept of giving up, because giving up required wanting something badly enough to be disappointed when you couldn't have it. I turned off the amplifier. I sat in the dark for a while. Then I turned on my single, low-wattage LED panel and looked at my supply inventory, which I had memorized, but looked at again anyway. The way you check your phone when there's nothing on it, just for the comfort of a surface to fix your eyes on. 91 days of food at full ration, longer at reduced. Water reclamation functional. Air cycling operational. Power bank at 94%. Everything I had built was working exactly as designed. I was safe. I was completely, structurally, mathematically safe. I thought about the man who had stood still on the ice for a long moment before running. I thought about which direction he had run, and what was in that direction, and whether direction mattered anymore in the way I had always assumed it did. I didn't sleep that night. I spent it recalibrating my timeline, not because anything in the shelter had changed, but because something in me had. The math I had always run on failure and collapse had been abstract until that moment. The sound of that third presence on the ice had made it concrete in a way no transmission, no news anchor's exhausted voice had managed to. This was not a system failing. This was the failure. And I was the only person in the world, as far as I knew, who had a floor under their feet. By the third day, I had established a routine. Routines are the first thing a disciplined mind reaches for when certainty evaporates. Not because structure solves anything, but because it converts the unmanageable into the procedural. And the procedural can be executed without the parts of your brain that are still screaming. 0600. Check air quality readings and cycle the passive intake filter. 0630. Small breakfast. Generally a measured portion of oats or a ration bar, eaten slowly and deliberately because eating slowly made it last longer in a way that wasn't purely caloric. 0700 through 0900. Maintenance review of all primary and secondary systems. 0900 through 1200. Shortwave radio monitoring, cycling frequencies every 20 minutes. Logging any coherent transmissions in the notebook I kept beside the unit. 1200. Lunch and a 30-minute period I had designated for non-functional reading. 1300 through 1700. Structured work on secondary projects. I had brought engineering manuals, a partially drafted technical paper I'd been writing on subsurface habitat stress tolerances, and a set of physical problems I gave myself in the manner of crossword puzzles. Except the puzzles were load calculations and flow rate estimations. 1700 through 1900, physical movement. The hull's interior gave me approximately 37 feet of usable length, and I had worked out a circuit of calisthenics and a measured walking pattern that covered, by my estimation, about 2 miles per day when executed in full. 1900, dinner. 2000 through 2200, shortwave again, then the notebook. 2200, lights to minimal, sleep or the attempt. The radio was the variable that disrupted everything. On day 4, I found a signal out of Duluth. A man was broadcasting on an amateur frequency. Call sign KD0WTR, which I wrote down out of habit. His name, he said, was Gerald. He was 59 years old, a retired electrician, and he was in his house in the Morgan Park neighborhood, which he reported was still mostly clear. He was broadcasting in the blind, just transmitting into space without knowing whether anyone received him. And his voice had the careful, deliberate quality of someone who has decided that if they're going to do something, they're going to do it properly. Gerald gave me my first coherent picture of what had happened. It had started in 3 cities simultaneously, or near simultaneously, within a window of 6 hours, which he thought argued against a single-point source event. Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit. The initial transmission vectors were disputed in the early broadcasts he'd monitored. But the outcome was not. Within 48 hours, both Chicago and Detroit had lost all organized emergency response capability. St. Louis followed 18 hours later. Minneapolis had held a perimeter for approximately 72 hours before the National Guard units defending it had fragmented. Not broken in battle, Gerald was careful to note, but simply dissolved. Individuals peeling away to find their own families. The institution collapsing from inside rather than being overwhelmed from outside. The infected, Gerald said, were not fast. This was important. He had seen several from his upstairs window during the first wave's passage through Morgan Park, and the word he used was deliberate. They moved with the unhurried persistence of something that had no concept of time pressure. They did not tire. They did not respond to cold in any way he had observed. The temperature in Duluth had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of the 16th, and the infected he could see from his window moved through it without any visible change in behavior. They were drawn to sound and to light, he believed, and they communicated. He hesitated on this word, then used it in the register I had heard from inside the hull, that sound I couldn't name. He called it calling, said that when one of them made that sound, others converged from distances that shouldn't have been possible if they were relying only on their own perception. I transmitted back to Gerald. Short, factual. I told him I was in a secure location and asked if he had a clear water supply. He did. I asked if his house was structurally sound enough to endure a sustained winter without heating fuel. He said probably not past late January. We agreed to maintain contact. Twice daily, 0800 and 2000. I went back to my log and added Gerald's information in the careful, annotated way I recorded everything. Transmission, start time, signal strength, content summary, assessed reliability of source. Then I sat back and thought about a 59-year-old retired electrician sitting alone in a house in Morgan Park, Duluth, Minnesota, with a probably inadequate heating system and a radio, broadcasting into the void at scheduled intervals. The routine I'd constructed for myself suddenly felt less like discipline and more like a frame I had built around the same essential loneliness. Gerald missed the 0800 check-in on day 8. I told myself it meant nothing. Radios failed, batteries died, power fluctuated. A disciplined person didn't abandon a methodology because of one data point. I cycled through frequencies for 90 minutes, logging every coherent fragment I could find. There was a woman broadcasting from somewhere in Wisconsin. She identified the location only as a farm north of Wausau, who was calm and precise, and had organized a group of 11 people, including 3 children. There was a man in Grand Forks who was incoherent with either exhaustion or something else, and whose transmissions deteriorated over the course of 2 days until they stopped entirely. There was a burst transmission from what sounded like a military frequency, structured, encoded, impossible to parse, that appeared every 6 hours like a heartbeat, steady and inhuman. Gerald missed the 2000 check-in too. On day 9, at 1100, he came back. His voice was different, not injured, not panicked, quieter, more horizontal, if that means anything, like a sound that had been standing upright and had decided to lie down. He told me that 3 of them had come into his yard on the night of the 16th. He had stayed on the 2nd floor with the lights off and waited. They had been there for 6 hours. He knew because he had counted, not continuously but periodically, waking himself every hour in the way you do when you can't fully sleep but can't stay fully awake either. At approximately 400, a large sound had drawn them north. He thought it was a vehicle, still running somewhere, maybe automated, just running down the last of its fuel in an empty street. They had moved toward it and not come back. When Gerald described the 6 hours he'd spent in the dark on his 2nd floor, waiting, what struck me was not the fear in it, but the patience. He said, I kept thinking about what to do if they came through the door, not in a planning way, just the thought kept arriving, and I kept setting it aside, because it wasn't happening yet. That struck me as one of the most precise descriptions of the mental discipline survival actually requires that I had ever heard from anyone who wasn't a professional writing about it from safety. Gerald had arrived at it empirically, alone, in the dark. I told him something I hadn't said out loud since going underground. I told him the shelter's position. Not the exact coordinates, but enough. Lake, northern Minnesota, subsurface. I told him what I had and how long it would last. I don't know entirely why I did this. Partly because he had just demonstrated something that earned it. Partly because the knowledge that someone else in the world knew where I was felt, in that moment, more important than the operational security I'd maintained for 4 years. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's very smart. I hope you built it big enough. I asked him what he meant. He said, People are going to be looking for down, not out. Sooner or later, someone else is going to think the same thing you did. I had thought about that. Of course I had thought about it. I was an engineer who had spent 4 years accounting for failure modes. But there's a difference between thinking about a threat in the abstract and having someone else say it to you in a tired, matter-of-fact voice from 150 miles away. The thought shifted register when Gerald said it. It became real in a new way. I looked at my access shaft. 14-inch diameter, vertical, topped with the fishing shanty hatch on the ice surface. Lockable from inside only, which I had considered a feature. The ice above me was, in this moment, 4 feet 6 inches thick and would be growing thicker through January. No one was walking through it. No one was drilling through it without industrial equipment I was certain they did not have access to. But Gerald was right that the logic of going underground would occur to other people. It had occurred to me because I understood structural engineering and subsurface pressure dynamics. But plenty of people, I now realized, would arrive at the same destination through pure desperation rather than technical planning. What they would find when they arrived was a question I was not yet ready to answer. On day 19, someone found the fishing shanty. I heard them before I had any cognitive framework for what I was hearing. The acoustic sensor registered weight on the ice directly above the access shaft, specific and deliberate. Not the random transit of an animal or windblown debris. 2 distinct sets of footsteps, moving slowly, stopping, moving again, circling the shanty perimeter in a way that communicated examination rather than casual passage. I killed all my lights. In total darkness, with the amplifier at maximum gain, I listened. The ice above me was a conductor and a filter simultaneously. It stripped nuance from sound and passed through fundamentals. Breath I could not hear. Weight distribution I could. These 2 people were not panicked. They were methodical. One of them was heavier than the other by a meaningful margin. They spent approximately 4 minutes examining the exterior of the shanty before I heard the sound of the latch being tested. The hatch was locked from inside. A standard marine-grade compression latch, supplemented with a secondary bolt I had added myself. Neither was breakable by hand. The person testing it would feel the resistance and conclude either that it was frozen shut, plausible in November, or that it was locked from within. A long pause, then a voice, muffled, transmitted through ice and water and steel, but identifiably female. The words were lost. Then a second voice, lower, also female. A short exchange. I caught nothing semantic, only the shape of conversation, one person proposing something, the other considering it. Then both sets of footsteps moved away. I stayed in the dark for 45 minutes after the acoustic sensor went quiet. Not because I thought they were still there, because I needed the time. These were not infected. The infected did not test latches and have conversations. These were survivors. 2 of them, moving on foot across a frozen lake in November, which meant either that the road system was impassable or that they were avoiding it. They had found my shanty, found it locked, and left. Where they went from there was a question that occupied me for the rest of that day with an intensity that I could not suppress or redirect through the routine. I tried. I executed my maintenance circuit, ate my scheduled lunch, sat with the shortwave and log transmissions with my usual precision. The question persisted beneath all of it, running in background like a secondary process I couldn't terminate. I told Gerald about it at 2000. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he said, "Did they seem healthy?" I told him I couldn't tell. They'd been methodical and quiet. No evidence of distress or disorientation. Gerald said, "You know what I'm going to ask next." I did. He asked it anyway. "Are you going to try to find them?" Here is what I had built the shelter to accomplish. Not survival in the abstract, but my specific survival. One person, self-sufficient, sealed from vectors of infection and vectors of human unpredictability for a defined window, while the outbreak burned through its available fuel. I had made peace with the architecture of that intention over 4 years of building. It had a moral logic I had examined from every angle I could construct and found, if not comfortable, then defensible. 2 people on the ice had just walked through the hole in that logic. I told Gerald I didn't have a way to find them without breaching the shelter. Once the hatch opened, I was exposed. Not just to environmental temperature, which I could manage, but to the possibility of contact with infected material on the ice surface, to the sonic profile of my presence breaking the silence of the lake, to the irreversible loss of the one advantage I had, invisibility. Gerald said, "I know." I said, "I'm not going to open the hatch." Gerald said, "I know that too." We moved on. I gave him a weather summary. The temperature had been dropping, which was bad for him and his heating situation, and good for my ice cover. He gave me an update on the farm woman from north of Wausau, whose broadcasts had become a de facto daily briefing for both of us. Her name was Petra. She had 23 people now. She was organized in a way that made Gerald and I both feel something adjacent to hope, though neither of us used that word. When I signed off at 2100, I lay in the dark and thought about two women walking on ice, finding a locked hatch, and making the decision to keep walking. On day 23, they came back. This time, there was a third set of footsteps with them, lighter than either of the first two, smaller. I registered the weight distribution on the acoustic sensor, and my brain supplied the categorization before I consciously decided to categorize it. Child, maybe 9 or 10 years old, by the lightness of the impact. They spent longer this time, 15 minutes on the ice above me. I tracked them by the pattern of vibrations, reading their movement like a blueprint drawn in pressure. At one point, all three stopped directly above the access shaft. Then the lighter set of footsteps moved a few meters east, and I heard, transmitted through the ice with startling clarity, the sound of someone sitting down. The child was sitting on the ice. The two women stood near the hatch again. One of them knocked on it. 3 times, deliberate and spaced. Not a pounding, a request. The kind of knock you put on a door when you know someone might be inside, and you want them to know that none you know. I did not respond. She knocked again. Same pattern. Then she spoke. And this time, the ice carried her voice with enough fidelity that I caught the sentence almost complete. She said something close to, "We're not sick. We've been out here 5 days. There's a little girl." I was sitting 2 feet below where she was crouching, separated by 31 feet of water and ice and steel, and also by the entire architecture of a decision I had made about what mattered and to whom. I didn't open the hatch. What I did do was this. I went to my secondary storage compartment and took out one of the 4 waterproof sealed containers I had prepared in the early stages of shelter construction as emergency surface drop kits. Each one contained a 3-day food supply, a mylar blanket, a chemical hand warmer pack, and a single-use water purification kit. I had built them for scenarios I hadn't fully defined. The instinct of a catastrophist who knows you can't predict the precise shape of the thing that breaks you. There was a secondary port on the access shaft. A small, externally accessible compartment originally designed for water sampling equipment, repurposed during construction. It opened from inside without compromising the primary seal. I loaded the container into it and released it to the surface. I heard it emerge. I heard her react. A sharp intake of breath, or something close enough to it that my brain resolved it that way. A brief, rapid exchange between the two women. Then the child's footsteps moved back toward the hatch. Silence. Then one more knock. 2 this time, not 3. Different pattern, not a request, something else. An acknowledgement, maybe. Then they left. I sat with the fact of what I had just done, and I took it apart carefully, the way I would examine a structure under unexpected load. I had not opened the hatch. I had not breached the seal. I had not introduced any external material into the controlled environment of the shelter. I had passed something out through a contained secondary port that maintained full internal isolation. By every technical and operational measure I had defined for myself, I had not violated the shelter's integrity. What I had done was start a conversation. I told Gerald that night. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, 3 days of food buys them 3 days. What happens on day 4? I said I didn't know. He said, yes, you do. They came back on day 26, 3 days exactly, which told me something about the woman who had counted. This time I was waiting at the secondary port with another container loaded. I released it before she knocked. She paused. I could track the hesitation in the weight distribution above me, and then retrieved it. The child's footsteps moved around the shanty in a pattern that read as habitual, like someone who had been told to stay in a defined area and had accepted the instruction. The two women stayed near the hatch for longer than the retrieval required. At 800, I told Gerald about the exchange. He told me about a development in Duluth. There was a group using the high school as a base. He had seen their light the previous night, deliberate in its pattern, clearly a signal. He hadn't left his house to investigate because his house was between him and them. and between meant crossing open ground. We had been talking for 3 weeks. In that time, Gerald had become the primary architecture of my social world, which was a strange thing to recognize, because Gerald was a retired electrician I had never met, in a city I had driven through twice, and our entire relationship existed in the compressed exchange of radio transmissions. But his voice had become calibrated to my expectations in the way that familiar voices do. I knew when he was tired. I knew when he was holding something back. I knew the specific silence that preceded his most direct observations. That morning, he held something back. At 2000, he told me what it was. His heating system had failed 2 days ago. He had been managing with layered insulation and a small propane unit he'd found in his garage. But the propane was nearly exhausted. The temperature in his house had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. He had not told me sooner because, he said, there was nothing I could do about it, and he had not wanted to spend our limited transmission time on a problem with no solution. I asked him how cold it was expected to get. He said the forecast, from the last functioning automated weather broadcast he could find, was calling for lows near -14 over the following week. -14 Fahrenheit in a house at 38 degrees with exhausted propane was not survivable. Not for a 59-year-old man maintaining the caloric intake possible from whatever is in his kitchen. I said, the high school group. He said, yes. I said, you need to go to them. He said, I know. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who hadn't thought about this. It was the silence of a man who had thought about nothing else for 48 hours and had arrived at a conclusion he was not comfortable with but could no longer argue against. I wanted to tell him that going to the high school was the rational decision and that the rational decision was survivable. I had told myself similar things about my own choices and found them sustaining. But Gerald was not the kind of person to be comforted by rationalizations. He was too level for it. What he needed was not reassurance. It was a company in the acknowledgement of what the choice actually cost. So I said, the last 3 weeks of transmissions are in my log. Every word you said to me. I'll keep transmitting for you when you go. You'll have a record somewhere. He said, under a lake. I said, under a lake. He said, that's actually fine. That might be the best place for it. We agreed on a protocol. He would transmit one final check-in from his house before leaving, and he would try to re-establish contact from the high school if any of their equipment could be adapted to reach me. If I heard nothing for 5 days, I would continue transmitting on his frequency daily for 30 days before I accepted the silence. The next morning, he gave me his check-in, brisk and even, and said he'd see me on the other side. I have not yet decided what it means that I spent the following hour, not in grief exactly, but in a kind of recalibration. The way a structure redistributes load when one of its members is removed, not collapsing but settling differently, finding a new shape for the weight it still carried. The women came back on day 29, and this time there were 5 people with them. I heard the weight distribution shift before I fully understood what I was counting. The acoustic sensor registered the new pattern, and I sat with it for a full minute, adding footsteps, separating signatures, before arriving at 5 distinct individuals plus the child, who I had by now stopped mentally categorizing as a variable and started categorizing as a presence. 6 people total. The ice above me registered their weight with a specificity that made me acutely conscious of the geometry. I was 31 feet below 7 human beings in a temperature of -6 Fahrenheit, and they were standing on 4.5 feet of ice above a sealed hull that, with some effort and the right information, could theoretically provide shelter for people who were not me. The knock came. Same pattern as before. 3 measured impacts, spaced. Then a different knock. Harder, faster, not the woman's. A man's knock. Urgent, but not frantic, which was a distinction that mattered. Frantic meant compromised judgment. Urgent meant clear-eyed need. Then a voice I hadn't heard before. Male, deep, controlled, he said. And the ice carried it well, the way it had started to feel cooperative, like it had accepted my presence and was no longer filtering me from the world above. "We know you're down there. We're not asking to stay. We need medical supplies. One of our people has a deep laceration on his forearm, and it's going septic. We need wound dressing and antibiotics, if you have them." I had antibiotics. I had a full field medical kit, assembled with the care I had given every other component of the shelter, which was to say obsessively and with extensive research. Amoxicillin, ciprofloxacin, doxycycline, wound closure strips, irrigation syringes, compression bandages, a sealed suture kit I had learned to use from a manual, and 2 practice sessions on a foam training block. I also had the structural fact of my situation. Every material I passed through the secondary port reduced my reserves. Every interaction that made my location more widely known increased the probability of a situation I could not manage from inside a sealed hull. I sat with both of those facts, and I did the calculation I had been avoiding since day 19. The calculation was not complicated. It had a clear answer. It had always had a clear answer. I had just been building walls around it, made of operational logic and risk assessment. And the walls had been solid for 29 days, and now they had a septic forearm pressed against them from the other side. I put together a wound kit, Cipro from the reserve, not the primary. I had redundancy built into the medical supplies, specifically because redundancy was the only honest acknowledgement that your primary supply was going to be needed for something you hadn't predicted. Irrigation syringe, wound closure strips, compression bandage, written instructions on a laminated card. I had prepared for exactly this scenario, which told me something about myself that I chose not to examine too closely in that moment. I loaded the secondary port, released it, heard the woman's voice, the original woman, whose cadence I had memorized without intending to, say something to the man. Then sounds of movement, efficient, practiced, then a different knock. 4 times, new pattern. I had no key to that code, but I decided it was a thank you, and I wrote it in the log as such. And that's what it remains in the record. That night, I tried Gerald's frequency. Silence. I tried the farm woman, Petra. She was there, steady as ever, reporting her head count now at 29. I gave her a summary, vague on location, of the surface contacts I'd been having. She processed it without surprise and said, "Those kinds of people are going to come back." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do when they run out of lake to walk on?" Winter deepened. The ice above me grew to its maximum thickness. I tracked it by the changed acoustic signature of footsteps, which became shorter and harder as the density increased. By early January, the surface was carrying weight easily. The women came every 3 days with a regularity that had lost the character of coincidence and acquired the character of schedule. The group had grown to 11, and I knew their individual weights now the way a musician knows the notes of a scale. Not by conscious cataloging, but by accumulated exposure. The man with the septic wound had survived. The woman, I had started calling her the first voice in my log, which was not her name, but I did not know her name, had transmitted this information by leaving a folded piece of paper in the secondary port slot after retrieving a supply drop. She had written on it in a clear, angular hand. "Arm healing. His name is Theo. He says thank you specifically." I read that paper many times, not because it contained information I needed to act on, but because it had a texture that the radio log didn't. Physical paper, touched by a hand I had never seen, carrying a name I now knew in an exchange that had the specific intimacy of things passed under doors. Her name, I learned on the 3rd paper, was Nora. She had written it at the bottom of a supply request. She had begun making requests rather than just accepting what I provided, which I respected in a way I couldn't entirely justify logically, but felt as an improvement, a kind of honesty. The request that first time was for a specific type of wound dressing and for any anti-nausea medication I could spare. The anti-nausea medication told me someone was pregnant or someone was sick in a non-wound way. I sent both with a dosage card and a note that said, "Name of patient and specific symptoms if you can." She wrote back, "Mira, 41. Fever returning after 2 days reduced. Not a bite." She was sick before all this. Different kind of sick. She says she was managing it. Managing it meant prescription medication she no longer had access to. I spent 3 hours going through my medical kit with that context and found 2 items that were adjacent to what she was probably on. Not equivalent, adjacent. I sent them with a card that said, "These are not a replacement. Consult the enclosed reference page on interactions and dosage limits." Tell Mira I said her timing is terrible. Nora's response was a single line. She laughed. "First time in a week." The exchanges had stopped being transactions somewhere in there, and I hadn't marked the exact moment of transition, which bothered the engineer in me. The part that preferred clean phase boundaries and defined state changes. What I had now with the 11 people above me was not a relationship with defined parameters. It was something looser and heavier simultaneously. On January 19th, Nora left a note that said, "We've been sleeping in an equipment shed at the north end of the lake. Propane running down. Is there anywhere else you know of?" I knew the geography of this lake system in a way that nobody who hadn't spent 4 years building in it would. I knew the secondary outbuildings, the utility structures, the old ice fishing cabins that dotted the eastern shore. I also knew their structural limitations in deep cold and their visibility profiles. Most of them were obvious from the air or from the road, which still mattered because the road was not entirely empty. I wrote back a list, annotated. 3 options with thermal assessments and access notes. Third option was a half-buried utility bunker on the southeastern shore that the county had used for road equipment storage, now presumably empty, with a concrete construction that would hold heat better than anything else on the lake perimeter. I had looked at it as a secondary shelter option during my initial site surveys and dismissed it because its access was not concealment compatible for my purposes. For 11 people, it was better than anything else available. 3 days later, I heard footsteps traverse the ice in a long diagonal, moving southeast. All of them, the full weight census, moving with purpose. They had taken the third option. Gerald came back on January 24th. I was in the middle of my maintenance circuit when his call sign appeared on the frequency. Faint, signal degraded, but structurally Gerald's transmission pattern, which I recognized before I consciously processed it. I grabbed the mic and answered, and his voice came through with the particular quality of a signal bouncing off a compromised antenna, frayed at the edges but coherent at the center. He was at the high school. There were 31 people. A woman named Dr. Anselm, a family physician who had been treating patients out of her home clinic until the clinic became untenable, was functioning as their medical authority. They had power from a backup generator that a mechanical engineering teacher named Reyes had brought online, using fuel siphoned from vehicles in the school parking lot. Heat was stable. They had food for, Gerald estimated, another 3 to 4 weeks at current consumption before requiring resupply. He sounded different. Still Gerald. The levelness, the precision. But there was something added, a texture of engagement that hadn't been in his voice before. 3 weeks of total isolation had stripped something away, and being among people had given something back. A different something, not the same thing, but enough to constitute a net improvement. He told me about the group with a specificity that was clearly affectionate, without being sentimental. He told me about Reyes, who had retrofitted a classroom into a workshop and was fixing everything that anyone brought to him, with a focus that Gerald said was almost meditative. He told me about a teenager named Jules, who had somehow retained a functional cell phone with a downloaded library of audiobooks, and was running what had become a nightly listening session. 20 people in the gymnasium, lights low, listening to old novels in the dark. I told him about Nora and the 11 people on the surface. He listened without interrupting, which meant he was doing the same calculation he'd made me do. When I finished, he said, "Callum, how long before the ice starts going?" "March," I told him. Historically, the ice on Harlan Lake began to degrade in late February, becoming structurally unreliable by mid-March and gone by early April at a normal year. This was not a normal year in any meteorological respect. The cold had been deeper and more sustained than any winter I had recorded in the region. But even accounting for extended ice conditions, I was looking at a surface degradation window starting in 6 to 8 weeks. Gerald said, "And when the ice goes, where does your population go?" I said, "Nora's group." He said, "And where does Nora's group go if their bunker doesn't hold past February?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "You need to start thinking about surface." I had been thinking about surface. I'd been thinking about it the way you think about a structural failure you can calculate with precision but cannot prevent. The kind where you know the load exceeds the capacity, and you watch the margin close with the detached horror of someone who understands exactly what's coming and has built their entire professional identity around not letting it come. The shelter was designed for one person for 91 days. I was at day 61. I had 30 days of supplies at single-person consumption, or approximately 10 days at 3-person consumption, or approximately 4 days at 11-person consumption. The math was not compatible with the reality above me. I told Gerald, "I need a plan." He said, "Yes, you do. Call me tomorrow." That night, I did not sleep. I sat at the small fold-down desk in the living section and I designed on paper, the way I had designed the shelter itself, by hand, working through load calculations and flow problems and failure scenarios in graphite on gridded paper. I designed not a single solution, but a decision tree, branches of contingency, each one answering a specific failure mode of the ones before it. At the center of the tree was a decision that I'd been avoiding since November 14th. At some point, I had to open the hatch. I opened it on February 3rd. The decision point had been reached at 0400 that morning. Not dramatically, not as a crisis moment, but as a logical terminus. Nora had left a note 2 days earlier that said simply, "Mira is worse. The medication isn't enough. We need someone who knows how to make a different decision." There was no accusation in that sentence. It was purely informational, the way Nora's communication always was. She had an engineer's syntax, I had noticed, a preference for precision over expressiveness. That quality in her writing was one of the reasons I had trusted her in stages. I made a list, the things I needed to bring to the surface: the medical kit, fully loaded, 2 days of food supply, portable, the laminated protocol cards I had prepared for external triage scenarios, my outer weather gear, a headlamp on minimum output, enough to see, not enough to be a beacon. What I needed to leave behind: the radio, the log, the main supply bank, the shelter itself, active, sealed from inside by the secondary bolt system, which I had configured to allow re-entry from outside using a 6-digit combination that only I knew. The act of climbing the access shaft took 2 minutes. I had tested it during construction. 14 inches of diameter was workable but not comfortable. Coming up through the surface hatch into the fishing shanty was cold in a way I had forgotten cold could be. The thermometer read -19. I stood in the fishing shanty for 30 seconds, breathing carefully, letting my respiratory system recalibrate to outside air. A purely psychological adjustment, not a physiological one, but necessary regardless. Then I pushed open the shanty door. The lake was white and gray and completely still. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a thin seam of charcoal turning to ash. Across the ice, to the southeast, I could see the outline of the utility bunker, half buried, low profile, a dark rectangle against the white. A thin thread of smoke from a vent pipe, light in one small window, barely visible. I walked toward it. Every footstep was louder than I expected. 4 years of understanding the acoustic properties of ice had done nothing to prepare me for the subjective experience of being the sound source rather than the receiver. I was 50 meters from the bunker when the door opened and Nora stepped out. She was taller than I had imagined, which was a strange thing to realize, that I had been a meaning, mid-30s, short dark hair under a wool cap, the particular economy of movement of someone who had been managing exhaustion for long enough that it had become a posture. She looked at me across the ice for a moment. Then she said, "You look terrible." I said, "I've been underground for 81 days. She said, "That explains it. Come in. Mira's in the back." I followed her inside. The bunker was warm, warmer than I expected, which meant Rhea's level improvisation had happened here too. Or Nora was more resourceful than even her notes had indicated. 11 people, plus Mira making 12, in a space approximately 20 feet by 30 feet. Sleeping arrangements in one corner, a small propane stove in the center, a systematic organization to the supply storage along the north wall that I recognized immediately as Nora's architecture. Every face that turned to look at me as I entered had the same quality. Not hope, not desperation, but the measured assessment of people who had learned to evaluate quickly and revise slowly. The man whose arm I'd treated through a sealed port and a supply drop was the first one to stand. He extended his healed arm and offered his hand. I shook it. He said, "You're smaller than I thought." I said, "Everyone says that." He smiled at that, an actual smile. And the fact of it, after 81 days of receiving all human emotion through ice and radio frequencies, landed differently than I had anticipated. Harder, warmer. I went to find Mira. Mira was 53, not 41. Nora had given me her age wrong, which I learned later was because Mira had given Nora her age wrong, which was a detail that Mira found hilarious when I told her during her recovery, and which I've recorded in the log because it was the first genuinely funny thing in 81 days. What Mira had was a chronic autoimmune condition, lupus, managed for 12 years on a specific immunosuppressant that she had been without for 6 weeks. What I had in my kit was not the right medication, but it was the right category. And between my knowledge of the pharmacology and a methodical process of ruling out interaction risks with what Nora had been giving her, I was able to construct a temporary management protocol that reduced her fever within 36 hours. I stayed in the bunker for 3 days. In those 3 days, I encountered the 11 people above me as actual specific humans, rather than weight signatures and paper notes. And the distance between those two experiences was significant enough that I had to consciously process it in real time. There was a woman named Cass who had been a high school biology teacher and who had organized the group's water purification process with a rigor that impressed me professionally. There was a teenager named Rafi, whose primary contribution to the group was that he never stopped moving. He maintained their fuel supply, tracked their consumption with a notebook he carried everywhere, and had somehow identified and cleared a second access route out of the bunker area that nobody else had thought to find. There was a couple, June and Sarah, who had been driving north to visit Sarah's parents when everything collapsed, and who had ended up at Harlan Lake by a chain of decisions that involved an overturned truck on Highway 2, a gas station, and Nora, who had been the one driving the vehicle that found them. I learned all of this in the way you learn things about people when survival is the context. Not through biography, but through action. Through the specific choices people make when the choices are real. I also learned, on the second day, that they had been watching the lake approaches for infected movement since early December. Nora had established a watch rotation, 4-hour shifts, 2 people at all times. In those 2 months, they had seen 3 separate passage events, groups of infected moving across or near the lake, drawn by sounds I could not identify from inside the hull. Each time, the group had gone to complete silence and stillness and waited, and each time the infected had passed without locating the bunker. Nora described the watching in terms I recognized. She said, "The worst part isn't the moment they're close. It's the hour before, when you see them coming and you have to decide whether to trust the plan." I said, "What plan?" She said, "Don't make noise. Don't show light. Trust that they'll pass." I said, "Does it ever feel like enough of a plan?" She said, "No. But it keeps working, so I keep trusting it." On the third day, I went back to the shelter. Mira's fever was down, her color was better, and Nora had the management protocol written out in her angular handwriting on a fresh page of her notebook. The group walked me to the shanty access point as a collective, which I hadn't expected. Theo shook my hand again. Rafi gave me an inventory of supplies they could spare, modest, but offered with a seriousness that made the modesty irrelevant. I went back down the shaft. The shelter felt different when I sealed the hatch. The same dimensions, the same temperature, the same 40 feet of organized space I had lived in for 84 days. But it had acquired a quality it hadn't had before I left. It was no longer just a structure I'd built. It was the place I'd return to. I came back up 6 more times before the ice started going. Each time followed the same structure, Nora's note indicating a need, my preparation and ascent, a defined visit with specific purpose, a return to the shelter. The visits had a logic to them that felt cooperative in a way I hadn't designed, but recognized as sound. I brought technical knowledge. They had numbers and surface intelligence. They knew the lake perimeter, the approach vectors, the patterns of infected movement, in a way that my acoustic sensor data approximated but didn't match for granularity. We were exchanging information asymmetries, and both groups were better for it. Gerald, when I told him about this structure, said, "You've built a symbiosis." I said it wasn't intentional. He said, "Most useful things aren't." Gerald's group in Duluth had reached 43 people by late January. Dr. Anselm had organized a medical intake protocol and had managed 3 critical cases. 1 cardiac event, 1 advanced infection, 1 difficult birth that resulted in a child named for the school, Harland, which Gerald said was being pronounced with considerable local pride. Reyes had the generator running on a rotation now, alternating power periods to conserve fuel. Jules's nightly audiobook sessions had expanded to include a daily schooling period for 7 children, which Jules was running with what Gerald described as terrifying organizational competence for a 16-year-old. The world, it seemed, was not entirely absent of its previous inhabitants. It was compressed and relocated and functioning under conditions nobody had designed for. But it was present. It was doing the thing that people do when the alternative is not doing the thing. On my 6th surface visit, Nora walked with me to the shanty access point alone. The first time she and I had spoken to me without the full group present. The temperature had risen above 0 for the first time in weeks, which meant the ice surface had the particular quality of managed menace. Still solid enough, but communicating its future intentions. Water was beginning to pool in low spots. The acoustic quality of my footsteps had changed. She said, "How long do you have down there?" I told her. 31 days at single consumption, less with any additional load. She said, "And after?" I gave her the honest answer, which was that I had been working on that question for 6 weeks and had arrived at a partial answer. There was a farmstead property 4 miles east of the lake that I had identified in my pre-construction site surveys as having characteristics compatible with a more permanent group shelter scenario. Concrete foundation, well water, elevated position with a strong sightline perimeter, a secondary structure, a large equipment barn that could be adapted for expanded habitation. I had never been there. I had assessed it from survey data and satellite imagery from before the collapse. I did not know its current state. Nora said, "I know that property." I said, "Of course you do." She said it belonged to a family named Kohler. The father had died years ago, and the adult children had all moved away, and it had been empty for 3 years before the outbreak. She had driven past it twice during their movements. She had thought about it the way I had. from the outside, theoretically, and had concluded it was too exposed for a group of 12 to reach without risk. I said, for 12 people moving in February, yes. What about moving in groups of 2 or 3, in darkness, over a week? She looked at me for a moment. The winter light behind her made the ice surface look like a flat gray sky. She said, "You've been thinking about the extraction as an engineering problem." I said that was how I thought about everything. She said, "That's useful." We worked out the first phase of the plan, standing at the edge of my shanty, in -4 Fahrenheit, our breath making the same pattern in the air between us. It was not a complete plan. It was the first load-bearing member of one. The ice gave us 11 more days before it became structurally unreliable. In those 11 days, we executed 4 transfers of small groups, 2 or 3 people, moving in the pre-dawn hours using the route Rafi had identified, carrying what they could manage without slowing their pace. Nora stayed until the last. She organized the departures with the same precision she had brought to every other problem. Departure order determined by mobility and cargo capacity, with faster individuals carrying more weight to equalize transit time, with a signal protocol between the farmstead and the bunker, so each group knew the previous one had arrived before the next departed. I monitored each transfer from the shelter's acoustic sensor, tracking the weight signatures across the ice until they left the sensor's reliable range. Each time, the absence of the expected acoustic return, which would have indicated a group turning back, registered as a kind of confirmation, not relief exactly. Confirmation. Rafi went in the third group. He left a note in the secondary port 2 hours before departure that said, "I counted your supplies from memory when you weren't looking. You have more than you said. You should come sooner." I left the note in the log, beside the one from Nora, that had told me Theo's arm was healing. On the final day before I had to judge the ice impassable, Nora stood at the shanty and knocked. 3 times, the original pattern. I was packed. I had reduced the shelter to its core operational state, systems on minimum cycle, the log secured in its waterproof case, the radio set to passive monitoring with the transmission schedule programmed for automated daily check-ins on Gerald's frequency. The shelter would continue functioning without me for as long as the power bank held, as an unmanned node in a network that consisted of 2 people and whatever Gerald could reach from Duluth. I climbed the shaft for the 9th and last time. Nora was standing outside the shanty in the gray morning light with a pack on her back and a look on her face that I had learned, over the course of 6 weeks of reading her face in bad light and worse conditions, was her expression for, "I've made a decision, and I don't intend to argue about it." She said, "You're not staying." I said, "I know." She said, "The shelter will keep." I said, "I know that too." She waited. The ice surface between us showed the thin film of surface melt that told an engineer the ice was transitioning states. We had, I estimated, 4 days before the crossing became inadvisable, and perhaps 10 before it became dangerous. I pulled the secondary bolt behind me as I sealed the hatch. The shelter was locked, powered, monitoring. Beneath 4 feet of ice that would be water by April, 31 feet below the surface of Harlan Lake, Minnesota, 89 days of one man's careful preparation continued to hum in the dark. I turned and looked at the farmstead direction. Nora said, 4 miles. There's cover at 2 points. Rafi cleared a path marker. I said, "You prepared for the case where I'd agree." She said, "I prepared for every case. I just hoped for this one." We walked east across the ice. By the time we reached the eastern shore, the sun was fully up, the sky was a hard, pale blue, and the temperature had risen to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, which was the warmest day since November. The snow on the shore had a thin crust of refreeze from the previous night, and our footsteps broke through it with each step, a sound that was sharp and regular and completely indifferent to everything it meant. I thought about Gerald, in the high school gym in Duluth, listening to Jules read audiobooks to 43 people in the dark. I thought about Mira, whose fever had broken, whose timing was terrible, who had laughed for the first time in a week at a joke through a sealed port. I thought about the two women I had heard on the ice on November 14th, before I knew any of their names, when they were just weight signatures on an acoustic sensor and a voice asking for something through 4 feet of frozen water. The farmstead appeared at the crest of a low ridge as we came up from the lake's eastern shore. Concrete foundation, elevated position, the large equipment barn, exactly where the survey data had placed it. Smoke from a chimney, lights in one window. Rafi was standing at the barn door. He said, "I told you he had more supplies than he said." Nora said, "You were right. I still transmit. Every morning at 800 and every evening at 2000. From a radio Ray is rebuilt from components in the Kohler barn. Gerald answers most days. Petra from north of Wosow answers every day. 3 weeks ago, a new voice came in from the east. A woman named Bridget, calling from somewhere in Michigan, methodical and spare, who had found our frequency by cycling through bands and recognized the transmission pattern as deliberate. She joined. Last week, someone else joined. I've started keeping a second log. The shelter is still there. The ice melted in March as predicted, and the shanty floated free and eventually grounded on the eastern shore in a position I find oddly satisfying. It made it to where we made it, delayed by a season. The hull sits in the lake silt in 8 feet of water, powered down now. The log sealed inside in its waterproof case. Maybe someone finds it someday. Maybe the lake keeps it. 19 people in the Kohler farmstead. 200 miles of frequency between us and Gerald's people and Petra's growing settlement. Bridget's voice from Michigan, which means the Great Lakes corridor is not empty. The world did not end. It contracted, and it is carefully, without announcement, beginning to expand again. I transmit into that expansion every morning. Someone answers. That is enough.